Welcome to Religion in the American Experience, a podcast that explores how religion has shaped America and how America has shaped religion, which can help us as we wrestle with complex questions of American governance and purpose in the 21st century. Here's your host, Chris Stevenson.
Welcome to Season 4 of Religion in the American Experience. What did the intersection of African American civil rights work and Jewish politics look like in the 20th century? Why will an understanding of this particular thread in the American tapestry equip us to be more effective citizens in the work of perpetuating our democracy with its world-changing innovation of religious freedom as defined by the U.S. Constitution's Article 6 and the Bill of Rights religion clauses? Dr. Marc Dollinger will guide us today in answering these and other questions. Marc Dollinger is Professor, Richard and Rhoda Goldman Chair in the Department of Jewish Studies at San Francisco State University. He has a Ph.D. in history from UCLA and is the author of several books, including Black Power, Jewish Politics, Reinventing the Alliance in the 1960s, which is the basis of our discussion today. Dr. Dollinger's research interests include American Jewish history, Jewish social responsibility, liberalism, Jews and public policy, church-state separation, modern Jewish history, and modern Jewish identity. Marc, thank you so much for being with us today.
I'm honored to be here and just a big fan of everything the National Museum of American Religion is doing. I'm excited.
Thanks, Marc, for that plug. In your book, you share the story of you as a new college freshman in 1982, asking a student leader of the African Student Union if they want to start a Black Jewish dialogue, and that's in quotes from you. That person laughed at you, but you then rejected his apology-motivated offer to ask his fellow club members if they would be interested, saying, quote, "Thanks for the offer, but there's no need," close quote. You write that this book, Black Power, Jewish Politics, Reinventing the Alliance in the 1960s, is your effort to respond to that very moment. Can you give us the backstory here?
Yeah, thank you. And I really appreciate that as the opening question because that story was not in the book originally. I wrote the book as an academic historian. I'm a white man, and I was trained with the idea that as an academic historian, you can write about any story about any person, any place on earth at any time. And if you did a really good job, you'd be a good historian. And if you didn't, you'd get bad reviews. After I'd finished the manuscript and had in fact already sent it in, to be published, I was having a conversation with one of my colleagues at San Francisco State University, Professor Javon Johnson, who now actually heads the Black Studies program at UNLV. And we were talking about racial privilege and what it is for him as a Black man, for me as a white man, to sort of be operating. And through my conversations with him, it sort of, dawned on me a little late that it kind of mattered that I'm a white man writing a book on race. And it would matter to the reader to understand where I came from. But we even got to page 1. So I reached out to my editor and I said, I'd like to break a basic rule of academic history, which is, you're not supposed to insert yourself in the narrative. You're supposed to write from a third person, dispassionate, detached viewpoint. And I said, the reader needs to understand all the complexities involved and they need to know my lens. So I thought to myself, how could I best explain to the reader where I'm coming from? And instantly I came up with this story. It's the first week of college. And, I'm a white kid from the LA suburbs and I'm so excited for a Black Jewish Alliance. And I just smile and walk right up to the table. And my classmate, he said to me, "I'm from Harlem." And like literally I knew what that meant, that he was raised in New York City in what was then a predominantly Black neighborhood. And I was raised in a white suburb of LA. But I also realized that he was communicating something deeper to me in that moment, which was that it meant a lot that he was raised Black in Harlem and I was raised white in LA, And it was only that we both ended up at UC Berkeley in 1982 that we ended up standing in front of each other, now talking about really profound differences between us, even at that moment, not to mention going back to the civil rights movement in the 50s and the 60s.
Okay. That's helpful. What was your growing up like as far as race and religion? What sort of backgrounding did you have as you stood there in front of him? Was there quite a bit, or was it? I mean, you were a teenager, right? I can't assume that there was a lot, but tell us anything that we need to know about your growing up in this respect.
No, I appreciate that. There was a little, which turned out to be a lot. In other words, I was raised in a suburb with very few Jewish people. There was a large Catholic population around me, so most of my friends at school were going to CCD. And then I realized, I said, I'm going to Hebrew school, right? Because if you're Jewish, you go to Hebrew school. And for me, religious identity was about teaching all my friends in school about what it was to be Jewish. Like, I was the kid who taught about Hanukkah, in December, when that came up. So, and I appreciate that question because as I realize now, religion was quite formative for me. By the time I went off to college and ultimately came to graduate school, I think I'd already internalized that religion matters, that my religion was different and distinct from those around me, that I had an opportunity to teach about my religion and its impact, and then ultimately that's really guided my career.
Okay, great, fair enough. I had a good Jewish friend in high school, one of few, and so he was the guy that we went to for the Hanukkah explanation every Christmas. Um, by the way, the term American Jew or Jew, I just want to make sure when I say that or you say that, our listeners hear that they understand, or how do we understand that? Because I know there are several groupings, significant groupings of Jews in the United States, throughout the world, but let's say just in the United States, and they have very distinct and beliefs and viewpoints. How can we deal with that on this episode? Will you point things out to us as we go, or what should we know here at the beginning?
Yeah, this is a huge and important question, and I want to even back it up even
Okay.
beyond what we'll talk about with denominationalism. And this is a joke, but it's not a joke. When I teach the Introduction to Jewish Studies course at San Francisco State University, which is like first year entry level religion class, and I get a room full of students, and the first thing I say to them is, you could be Jewish and not believe in God. And then half my students, their chins drop. And then I figured these are my believing Christians because, from a Christian understanding of religion, how could one be in a faith based tradition if you don't have faith? And Judaism is a faith, it is a religion, it's also a culture, it's also a history, it's also sovereignty. Through the Talmud, it's also a legal system. We sometimes refer to folks as bagel and lox Jews. So they may not go to synagogue, they may not even have Jewish education, but culturally, they consider themselves part of the Jewish people. Technically, according to traditional religious mandate, anyone born of a Jewish mother is considered Jewish regardless of their level of observance. And I'm a member of the Reform movement, and we have patrilineal descent. So if you're born of a Jewish father and raised as a Jew, we also consider you Jewish. So this is a challenging part of Judaism for folks who aren't Jewish because they tend to want to put Jewishness into the religion category solely. And then it kind of gets confusing. Now, even within the religion category, which is I think what your original question is, there there is a broad range of ritual observance from those who follow the 600 or do their best to follow the 613 commandments in the Torah, for the first part of the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament, as Christians would call it. The Orthodox, we have a denomination of conservative, which is trying to uphold Jewish law in a modern context. So they're able to have some rabbinic legal rulings on some fascinating questions to try to be a traditional Jew in the modern world. I'm from the Reform movement, and we came from the emancipation of the Jews in Europe, mostly, to the idea that we can reform traditional Judaism to be aligned with modern life. And we have other smaller movements, Reconstructionist as well. And the interesting thing on the civil rights angle is that there is an inverse relationship between level of religiosity and engagement in the civil rights movement, which is to say, Orthodox Jews and Orthodox rabbis were all but non-existent. There were several who were well known, but for the most part, in the traditional observant Orthodox community, racial equality was not necessarily seen as a Jewish issue. In the conservative movement, slightly less ritual bound, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel is the best known because he marched alongside Dr. King, most famously Selma II, and Dr. King, considered Rabbi Heschel his rabbi, um, and he was in the conservative movement. And it's also true that many of his own rabbinic colleagues, he taught at the seminary in New York, didn't think taking time away from to do civil rights was a Jewish religious thing. Of the denominations, it was the Reform movement through its Religious Action Center in Washington, D.C., that was most engaged. And but actually, if you went south in the 60s and went into any room with sort of, white civil rights worker allies, um, could be more than half of them would be Jewish, even though Jews just comprise, what, 2, 3% of the population. But most of them are there in, if you ask them, in a secular way. A lot of them were political leftists, were socialists. Some of them were even communists. Um, so in a weird way, the people that are rejecting organized religion the most are the ones who are most engaged in this social justice work. And as some of my colleagues like to joke, here is a case where the rejection of one's religious identity, Jewish religious identity, is in fact an affirmation of it.
Okay, lots there to think about, but I think that's very helpful for us as we go through today's episode. So thank you very much. I think that's super clearly said, and I appreciate that. So let's jump into the book, into the chapters here. Early on, you mentioned a 1958 article in the NAACP newsletter, The Crisis, which blamed American Jews for their complicity in the country's system of racial oppression. Help our listeners understand this and its significance here at the beginning of your book, the beginning of your narrative.
Yeah. So actually, let me back that up and then I'll move through. The book's first title, when I sort of had the idea of writing it, was Turning Inward: American Jewish Life in the 1970s. Because in the 19 se and I was raised in the '70s, so this book was a little bit of self-discovery. A new generation of young Jewish kids, became more Jewish in a variety of ways. And I was fascinated to better understand. Maybe a little later, we'll talk about some of those Jewish religious revivalist movements. But I started doing the research, and it pulled me back to the 1960s, and the Black Power movement, which ultimately is how the book was retitled, because I found that American Jews emulated the strategies and tactics of Black Power to increase their own Jewish religious identities. And then that brought me back to the chapter you're describing, the first chapter, which was on the 1950s. And what I noticed in the night, so typically the 1950s are the high watermark of the civil rights movement, the Montgomery bus boycott, the Brown decision, when Dr. King, is gaining prominence. And at least in the historical memory of my generation of American Jews, it was all good. You know, it's like an interracial alliance committed to helping, Black folk to begin with, but American democracy on a larger level. What could go wrong? And then I'm in the archives and I found this 1958 NAACP piece, and the shocking thing for me, well, first was just to read that, because that was kind of against what I thought, but then I started reading Jewish organizational leaders responding to that comment, and for the most part, they agreed. And I dug even more into the sources and came to understand that white and typically male, middle-aged Jewish leaders in the 50s understood in a deep way the depth of American racism and white supremacy. And they were publicly writing and publishing that starting in the 1950s, American Jews, as Eric Goldstein and Karen Brodkin have written, became white. In other words, the anti-Semitism, which was so prominent in the 20s and 30s, after World War II and after the Holocaust, American Jews were accepted more by Christian America and were able to, for example, move into white suburbs in the 50s. And with this, as Jews, they're like, okay, we're a religious minority and we face persecution on the one hand. And on the other hand, now we're being accepted into white Christian America as equals. And and then the Jewish civil rights leaders understood that even though there are similarities between blacks and white Jews because of discrimination, there's also a huge difference between them on racialization. And, I was amazed by how much and how often Jewish leaders understood what was really going on.
So while the idea that Jewish Americans were helping the civil rights movement, I mean, this is a broad brush here, but the picture in our mind, uh, that the blacks in America and Jews in America were working together for black civil rights, that picture is accurate, but also not complete. Is that fair? I mean,
Yeah. Now, first of all, we'll start on the accurate part. Um, since 1928, American Jews have been the most liberal, progressive voting bloc of any ethnic, racial, religious group in America. Only African Americans, in this case, would be the Democratic Party, are voting more for the Democratic Party. And there was incredible disproportionate support by white Jews of the civil rights movement. Those who went south and risked their bodies and for Schwerner Goodman and Cheney were murdered in Mississippi with their lives, but also in the NAACP, which was its formation group included prominent Jews. In terms of political support, in terms of financial support, it was stronger than any other white American group. And if we segment American Jews, well, we can start with Southern Jews. What do you do if you're a white Southern Jew in the civil rights movement and Northern Jews are coming south to protest? And they protest for a couple days and they go back home and they're heroes. And now the Southern white Jews are getting all the wrath of the white Christian racists in the South who are upset that the Jews just came down fighting. Um, and for Southern Jews, it's tricky business. On the one hand, they're facing anti-Semitism, and the lynching of Leo Frank in 1913 was in the lived memory of many Southern Jews. And on the other hand, they're classified as white in the South. They're not black, so they're getting a lot of privilege. So Southern Jews were in a really awkward, challenging spot. A few of them did take public positions in favor of civil rights, and some rabbis did have their synagogues bombed as a consequence. Others actually joined the White Citizens Council as outward racists. In one of the famous pictures at the Pettus Bridge in Selma, with King and Heschel marching together, in the background is a Jewish-owned store that was segregated too. So in a single image, we see the complexity of what it is to be Jewish in America and what Jewishness would mean.
okay. That's super helpful, and you write in your book that Jews joined the civil rights struggle in the 50s, late 40s, 50s to, quote, "extend the individual rights protections of American law to African America," close quote, and I found that significant. You talk about individual rights and then group rights, which is what happened in the 60s, that sort of turn, and we'll get to that. Um, so that was a helpful explanation. You painted a good picture for us. Now, and this, as you say, Black Power is the major thread in your book. What what changed, Mark, with President Johnson's Great Society as the stage for Jews as they worked out a number of communal dynamics? I'm quoting here, worked out a number of communal dynamics that led eventually to a sea change in their approaches to group-based liberalism Black power, and their own standing as American Jews, close quote. There's a lot there, Mark, I know, and you're the expert. Lead us through it here. What are the most important stories as we move from the 50s into the 60s that we need to understand about Jewish politics and Black power?
Yeah,
This is a fascinating thing you pull, so please.
yeah, thank you. So we'll start with like the competing definitions of liberalism. I start by sort of giving a more classical definition of liberalism, which is the idea that the systems of the country, of society, are basically okay, but they have some flaws. And through individual action in government, we could fix the flaws. And it's fundamentally rooted in individual rights. And this is right from the Declaration of Independence, that every person is endowed by their creator with inalienable rights, life, liberty, and for us, it was pursuit of happiness. In Europe, it was property. And this was great for the American Jewish social justice activists. So much of Jewish history in Europe, for sure, was about Jews not having equal rights as individuals. There was group based discrimination against Jews in the ghettos of medieval Europe. And the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, you mentioned sort of the religion clauses of the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, all of these really made an argument for American Jewish exceptionalism, that the United States was going to be different and better for Jews as Jews because of the religious toleration and inclusion that they felt. So I argued that Jews joined a civil rights movement because they wanted those same individual rights that were protected in the Constitution for them to be extended to Black Americans as well. And and here's where I kind of do a flip. In the mid 1960s, much of white Jewish America, and white liberal America too, began to understand that promising individual rights does not actually bring racial equality. In 1964, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act. The next year, they passed the Voting Rights Act. This achieved the end of segregation, the end of Jim Crow. This was really what Blacks and white Jews had been fighting for and dying for to achieve. Civil rights, individual rights were now guaranteed by federal law. Yay, game over. Except the game wasn't over. Because as we know, racism, institutional racism, white supremacy is not simply legal, and it can't be solved by passing an individual rights-based law or set of laws. So here's where Lyndon Johnson came in. He called himself LBJ because his political mentor, Franklin D. Roosevelt, called himself FDR. And Johnson wanted to do what even his mentor, FDR, could not do in the New Deal, which is address racism. FDR made a calculated decision in the 1930s that he was not going to address racism in America because he needed the support of the white South. And LBJ said, okay, guess what? Like, we've got the Civil Rights Act, we've got the Voting Rights Act. Now it's time for us to recognize group-based inequality. That even in American society, even with the exceptionalism that we like to think that we have discrimination based upon people's group status. So he designed the Great Society to focus on group-based racial discrimination, and then took far more aggressive action to bring racial equality, much more than the individual rights approach. And this is where most all white, northern, urban ethnics bolted, because they're like, we're all for legal equality, but we're not for things like affirmative action or quotas or what's called maximum feasible participation. That was the key phrase for a lot of his work in American cities to try to get people mobilized. And by 1968, there was a turn to the political right, and an abandonment of liberalism and LBJ and the Great Society.
Okay. So so before we get to the next, we're going to get to this chapter about turning inward, which you referenced a few minutes ago, but I want to spend a little bit more time on more of what you just explained. So talk to us about Black Power that arose during the late 60s and then the Jewish engagement with that uh, approach to observing, what they thought and how they acted regarding Black Power. Tell us this story. I think it's important one that you write about. Obviously, it's the thread in the whole book.
Yeah. Thank you. So, we have a very diverse American Jewish community in every possible way, and there's very diverse African American communities as well. And within the civil rights movement, which was African American based, led, created, um, there were internal divisions over what's the best way to achieve their goals. Dr. King, who took a more moderate liberal approach, believed that bringing in white allies and crossing the racial line was the best way to achieve change. And he, of course, followed Gandhi's nonviolent strategy. As a Christian minister, he was very much influenced by the Black church, and really used religion as his guide. And there was, opposition. It was largely generational. Sort of the younger generation of Black activists were skeptical about an interracial alliance. They said the moment you bring white people into the movement, they'll seek to control it. They'll seek to dilute it, as Malcolm X had later described. And the only way that you're really going to achieve an end to white supremacy is when Black folk have the ability to lead, run, and create change on their own terms. So there began a pushback against Dr. King and against the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the slogan became Black Power and unapologetic Black pride and, um, famously, Malcolm X said, it's not that white people don't have anything to do. Like, go in your own communities and fight racism. That's your job. But when it comes to civil rights organizations, they need to be Black led at the very least. So the Black Power activists have been described by whites who didn't like them as militant or revolutionary. And they were really ostracized and marginalized by much of mainstream white America. And certainly, after the election of 1968, and the neoconservative movement also really pushed back against Black Power. And within American Jewish life, the Black Power, at least when I was raised, the Black Power movement was seen as anti Jewish because a lot of Black Power activists became anti Zionist and especially even more after 1967, when the state of Israel took control of Palestinian lands in the West Bank and in Gaza, in the Golan Heights, Sinai Desert. And there were times when Black Power was overtly anti Semitic as well. So the line was that everything was great with Dr. King. And everything was great when these two religious groups would come together in unity. But the moment the radicals, the militants, the Black Power, the anti Zionists, the anti Semites took over the movement in the mid 1960s, it all got destroyed. And that was the telling that I learned. And then I went to the sources and I was shocked to discover rabbis giving sermons on the high holidays of Judaism, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, the New Year, and the Day of Atonement, where they were saying nice things about Black Power. These were like old white men saying nice things about Black Power, and that really changed the title of the book. It changed the focus of the book and sort of reoriented myself from there.
Okay, that's great. What else? So let me see. We're going to talk about turning inward. We're going to talk about American Zionism and the Black Power thread there. Um, Before we do that, is there anything else you want to talk to us about? Maybe some stories or some specifics on you mentioned reading some of these shocking to you that these Jewish leaders were supportive of Black Power leaders, even as they had kicked out Jewish help, right? Any
Right.
white help. Um, Anything else you want to tell us about this before we move on to those other topics?
Yeah. Yeah, sure. So I read about Rabbi Arthur Hertzberg, a rabbi, Columbia University professor, a well-known author, and he wrote in the height of the discord between Black power and the Jews. And he was writing to white Jews, and he said, "We of all people should be able to understand the rhetoric of Black power, even though we are on the firing line of its attack." That could be a bit paraphrased, but that's essentially what, and I kept reading that line over and over again, and I said, "He wrote this at the time of the greatest amount of discord. He openly acknowledges that white Jews are on a firing line." That's a heck of a metaphor. And then he says, "We of all people should be able to understand it." And once I saw that understanding, Rabbi Roland Gittleson, Temple Israel of Boston, who in 1948 was on Harry Truman's White House Commission on Civil Rights, who in the 1950s and 60s sent his own congregants south in the Dr. King approach, and they got themselves arrested, sent to Parchment Prison in Mississippi. Now he's giving a sermon where not only is he saying like nice things about Black power, but he says Black power is actually its own version of Jewish history. That what created Black power is something that in the Jewish community we experienced in our own way. And then he took it one step further and said, uh, Black power movement revitalized Black culture in America. We need to revitalize Jewish culture and the Jewish religion in America. We should be as proud and public in our Judaism as Black power activists are in their Blackness. So let's, instead of pushing Black power away, and we should embrace it. We should read their handbook. We should translate it to Jewish causes.
Fascinating. And this sort of just blew you away as you were unearthing these things.
I knew my book would be published as soon as I read those quotes because they so conflicted with everything I learned in Jewish education growing up as a kid, conflicted with the journalistic accounts that I had read, conflicted with even the academic scholarly books that all, in my mind, fell into the trap of like blaming Black power for the end of the alliance. And by going back to the 1950s, I saw white Jewish leaders knew the alliance had its limits because Jews enjoyed racial privilege and whiteness counts, in this part. And then the idea that that we would not have had the social we would not have had the Jewish religious revival of the 70s were it not for the Black Power movement of the 60s. That just blew me away.
Right. Let's get into a little bit of that. You have an entire chapter about turning inward, Black power and Jewish youth movements. I think this is one of the things you're talking about. Why did this happen? What are some of the details as well?
Yeah, so, we'll just start with the Soviet Jewry movement,
Okay,
just
fair
just
enough.
just a
Yep.
as one example. So there's an attempt by American Jews to get what was then Soviet Union to, allow its Jewish citizens to leave the country because there was terrible anti-Semitic discrimination against them. So the first question that came to mind to me, so I should say the argument they used was an anti-communist Cold War argument. So Jewish leaders went to the federal government and say, we don't like the communists, we don't like the Soviet Union, we like democracy, we like America, and there's no better way to be anti-communist and pro-America than to fight for Soviet Jews to be able to leave. They made that connection. And I thought to myself, I get the connection because it's really good if you're a religious minority and you wanna bring political change, you've gotta find an argument that applies to everybody, not just to your religious group. Um, Except that if that was gonna be their argument, they should have had a Soviet Jewry movement in the mid-1950s. 'Cause that was when anti-communism, McCarthyism was at its height, and if you wanted to leverage America's disdain for the Soviet Union to try to help Jews in the Soviet Union, they were like 10 to 20 years late. So then the new question for me was, why did they wait until the '60s and really till the '70s to do Soviet Jewry movement? That's because in the 1950s, with Jews gaining acceptance in Christian America, the last thing they wanted to do was out themselves as Jews. In fact, in a previous book, I'd tell the story about how some Jewish kids at a public elementary school are obligated to sing Christmas carols, which happened a lot. So the local Anti-Defamation League wrote a letter to the principal to say, you cannot have Jewish kids singing Christmas carols. This is a violation of church-state separation. And the parents of the children called the Anti-Defamation League and said, don't send those letters. We want our kids singing Christmas carols. We worked hard to get accepted in Christian America. Don't ruin it for us, right? So in the 1950s, the idea that Jews would take to the streets in public as Jews was opposite of sort of what the religious moment was for them. But somehow in the late 60s and the 1970s, they're like 10,000 strong in the streets having, massive demonstrations for Soviet Jews. Where did that come from? Largely, it came from all the social protest movements of the 60s, because everybody was democracy is in the streets in the 60s. And then when I started to do more particular research, like where in the 60s did it come from, it came from civil rights movement and Black Power. Here's a funny story. I was writing my first book, and I was in the archives at the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, and um, this is before the computer days, so you had to look like in what was called a card catalog, for those of us old enough to remember the card catalogs, and it said Freedom Ride 1974, which is a typographical error because the Freedom Rides were a decade earlier. But I called up, the folder, and on the folder it said Freedom Ride 1974. So whomever typed it did it twice. And then I pulled out the contents of the folder, and the Freedom Ride was 1974, just like it said. It was a freedom ride for Soviet Jews. There was a bus from Washington, D.C. to Seattle with Jewish college students who stopped in city after city to have rallies for Soviet Jews, and they called it a freedom ride. It wasn't a
Yeah.
freedom ride because that's not what it was, but they borrowed that language. And I said, here is a literal connection between these young Jewish activists and the next generation from the civil rights activists, but they're using the language and the tactic and the technique of the earlier movement, but now they're focusing it just on the Jews.
Wow. That's fascinating. Okay. Do you want to talk a little bit about turning inward, some of the youth movements?
Yeah. So we'll go to college campuses to start. Um, ethnic studies as a field really comes in the late 1960s, and I'll boast that it really started at my university at San Francisco State. The longest student strike in U.S. education history ultimately created the nation's first ever College of Ethnic Studies. And the origin of the College of Ethnic Studies was Black Studies, call for Black Studies. And at college campuses, well, mostly in urban America, in the 60s, related to Black Power, was the call for Black Studies. So then Jewish students were like, yeah, we support Black Studies and we support Jewish Studies. So there began a parallel movement for Jewish studies, emulating Black studies for undergraduates, as right up to a professional association, which is now the Association for Jewish Studies.
Okay. Let's see. Let's talk briefly about American Zionism. So, at one point in your book, Mark, you write, "quote Black Power gifted American Jews with a new appreciation and enthusiasm for Jewish nationalism and helping inspire an unprecedented growth in American Zionism." Close quote. Can you share this story with us?
Yeah, so I think the best focal point for this is the 1967 Six-Day War, where Israel was involved in a war against a bunch of its neighbors and ended up, as a consequence, acquiring a whole lot of new land. It created profound political issues, which remain to this day because this is where the occupation of Palestinian lands began. Um, and American Jewish leaders were stunned and shocked by the reaction of American Jews to the Six-Day War. For example, days after the war ended, there was a luncheon in New York City to raise money for the state of Israel. They raised $18 million in 1 hour, and those are $1967. I don't know how much that comes out to today, but that was incredible. 7,500 Jewish college students called their parents and said, "Send me my passport," because they got on planes and flew to Israel to work in civilian jobs so that the Israelis in those jobs would be able to be in the military. This is a data point that people are kind of stunned by today. One of the polling services polled American Jews on what they thought about Israel. 97% expressed strong sympathy for Israel. I can't imagine today, with all the divisiveness that's occurring, especially after the Gaza war, that anyone could imagine a near total unanimous support about American Jews for Israel. And when I grew up and when I talked to my dear rabbi friends about, what was it that caused this incredible Zionistic, energy after the 67 war ended. And they, sort of talk about Jewish leaders and educators and rabbis and all the good work they did. And then I did the research on the book. And I said, no, I actually think it's Black power because part of Black power was Black nationalism. And there was an argument that Black folk in America cannot achieve equity unless they are in charge of their own destiny. And this is very much a Jewish nationalism argument, too, that Jews for nearly 2,000 years in the diaspora suffered because they could not control their own destiny. And if you combine that with the anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, ironically, of Black power, also, starting in 1964, 65 for the most part, by the time you get to 1967, we have a generation of American Jews who are energized by, for them, religious activism, and who are energized by the notion of nationalism, who've been given permission to be loud and public about their Jewish identities, and they become more Zionistic thanks to the anti-Zionist Black Power movement.
Quite a paradox there.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, Mark, in your last chapter, which was entitled After Black Power, Jewish Politics Since 1980s. Now, I want to leave the history a little bit and move to more now. You shared this, and the chapter was since 1980, but um, in the third and most current period, deeper awareness of intersectional identities recognizes that Blacks and Jews can, in fact, be one and the same, close quote. When I read that, I was sort of startled. I wanted to understand its significance and the meaning here. Help us understand this. What are you getting at?
Yeah. Uh, I'll go back to a famous lunch I had. This is um, before I'd even submitted the manuscript. And I was lunching with my friend Alana Kaufman. Alana is the founder and CEO of the Jews of Color Initiative. She is a Black Jewish woman. And I asked her to read my manuscript, to give me her opinion and her edits before I finally finished it. And she appreciated a lot of it, because as I've described, a lot of these theories are new to most white Jews. And then she said to me, "Where are the Black Jews in your story?" I mean, she said, "You've written 250 pages on Blacks and Jews, and not a single page on a Black Jew." And I said, "Well, there were no Black Jews. That's why I didn't write about it." And then she said, "Well, your book is actually about whiteness. It's about what happens to Jews as a religious group when they earn the privilege of white racial identity." So she said, "Go back and reread each of your chapters and ask yourself, how much of the," like I said, this is about US history, this is about the 60s, this is about Black power. Those are basically my three things I was arguing. She said, "How about a fourth? How much of this is about the fact that they were white? And if they weren't white, if they were Black like me, that wouldn't have happened." Is your story a story of whiteness as much as it's a story of Jewishness? And I was so taken by that critique, that I actually, wrote up an epilogue, which is now chapter 7 in the revised edition of the book, which is basically deconstructing the lunch I had with Alana. And here's the embarrassing, revealing part of the story. Only after the book came out and after the murder of George Floyd by Minneapolis police it's during COVID. I ended up doing about 130 Zoom classes on Jews and race, mostly to white Jewish audiences. And one of the people who came to one of my talks said, um, "Have you read the book by my late husband, Chuck McDew?" And she holds up a book. And I had no idea. I wrote down the cover. And it turns out, sadly, Chuck McDew, died too young, but he was the second chair of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which was really the activist young Black organization. The founding chair was Marion Barry, who went on to become the mayor of Washington, D.C., and he was followed by John Lewis. He also had more arrests than Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and he was, I think he was the most arrested in terms of civil rights protests. As his fellow activist Bob Lewis described him, Black by birth, Jewish by choice, revolutionary by necessity. Here I was, the scholar on Jews and Black power, and probably one of the most important, Black power type activists was a Black Jew. And I missed it, and I didn't see it, and, I mean, there's some deep reasons for that because he wasn't in the archives, right? That's that's a deeper question. Why does a Black Jew who's the chair of SNCC not get mentioned or brought into a Jewish archive? And Alana and Alana is now the author of the afterword of the revised edition of the book, because once the book landed, it created quite a conversation in Jewish America, a conversation among white Jews for sure, Black Jews also reading it in its various complexities. And so now we are, we're traveling about the country, sort of engaging a lot of the questions that you just described. Um, the phrase you mentioned that I put the phrase Black Jewish relations in quotation marks, and I appreciate you saying that I had done that earlier on.
Okay.
Um, I did that because what I learned from that lunch with Alana, the phrase Black Jewish relations implies that Jews are all white, because you can't have a relation between Blacks and Jews if a Jew is Black. Um, where does Alana and other Black Jews fit in the phrase Black Jewish relations? So I try not to use that phrase, and when I use it, I put it in quotes because it is an historical quote. The Jews of Color Initiative has now done actual research. It turns out roughly 12 to 15% of American Jews are Jews of color. Of course, it depends on the definition of Jew of color, um, and certainly it's generationally defined because the younger we go in the data, the more Jews of color there are and there will be. We already are a racially and ethnically diverse American Jewish community. It's one of our many diversities, and one, I think, positive product of my own learning from writing this book is recognizing, even in today's world, how important it is to understand all sorts of diversity.
Okay. Well, wow, fascinating. Absolutely. Have to think a lot about that. Let's move to the last question here. I'm going to foreground it by sharing uh, what I learned about you. In 2022, you were on national news discussing the idea of the need to reconstruct the Black Jew relationship in the then American public square back in 2022. And I found that uh, quite a compelling um, interview. I watched it on your website. Um, so, as we conclude, Mark, do you want to share any lessons or takeaways from this subject matter, either in terms of important historical transformations you are charting or in terms of helping us better understand our present moment in the American narrative? And I foregrounded this by that story because maybe you want to pull that in as well in answering this.
Yeah, thank you. There's the easy hard part and the hard part. I recorded that in 2022 before the Gaza war began. So to say, um, a lot of the challenges around the alliance between blacks and white Jews, which is now how I try to frame that,
Yep.
um, it was a hierarchical relationship. It really is difficult, if not impossible, to have an interracial relationship when half of them are racially or racialized at a higher level. And that's really what a lot of the dynamics were. So what I was talking about was if we're going to reinvent a new alliance between these two communities, it's got to be done as much as possible from a sense of common ground and common power. And since whiteness, conveys power regardless, that's really hard to do. So we need to at least start with a recognition and an understanding that there's a fundamental difference between being white in America, even if you're Jewish, and being black in America. I was on CNN, and there was an issue about whether Whoopi Goldberg had been anti-Semitic when she was describing the fact that a member of the KKK would be coming after her, and I argue that she's not anti-Semitic at all. In fact, if you grow up black and female in America and you see someone in the KKK, the risk level is high and you are a target. And if you're a white Jew and you happen to be wearing a Jewish star, you can just quietly put it, underneath your shirt. And chances are that white supremacist bigot is going to run right by you unless you're doing something that's identifying you as Jewish. So I was really speaking to um, white supremacy in America and the awkward place white Jews exist because, on the one hand, um, white Jews have benefit from white supremacy in their racialization as white because, like, I go into 7-Eleven and no one follows me. On the other hand, white supremacists are killing us when we pray, which is the worst that has ever happened in American Jewish history around anti-Semitism. So holding all that is difficult. So I was trying to sort of be as open as I could with that complexity. And now what's happened since the Gaza war is that there's profound splits between white Jews and their historic allies in other marginalized communities. There are huge splits within and among American Jews. It's largely generational, where you have sort of 20-something kids disagreeing with their parents and their grandparents. And on the one hand, like, the really hard part is there are friendships have ended. People don't talk to each other. There's deep, deep pain. And, one can't be optimistic, and it's problematic even to be optimistic, especially in the world as we see it today. All I can hope for, though, is that all of the pain is revealing truth, and we need to reveal that truth to be able to begin to address it. So I'm just hopeful that in this generation, and especially with the young people, holding all of these complexities I'm talking about, are going to be in a much better position to think about what to do about it than we were 50 or 70 years ago when maybe we were a little bit too naive.
Maybe even just 5 years ago. I think we know more today. But you end on a high note. The search for truth. I think we can all agree that the search for truth will be beneficial, and it's just getting at that truth can be very, very difficult. Mark, thank you. We have been speaking with Marc Dollinger, who is a professor and Richard and Rhoda Goldman Chair at the Department of Jewish Studies at San Francisco State University and author of Black Power, Jewish Politics, Reinventing the Alliance in the 1960s. Mark, I appreciate so much you giving your time and knowledge to help us better comprehend the intersection of Jewish America and Black America during the last century, but also bringing us up to its relevance today. In the difficult world we find ourselves in, this has equipped all of us to be better stewards of religion's role in perpetuating the American experiment in self-government.
Thank you so much. I'm honored to be here.
All right, Mark, thank you.
Religion in the American Experience is produced by the private, digital-first National Museum of American Religion. Scholarly support is provided by Dr. Lauren Turek, and audio and video assistance by Dr. Randall Stevens. The music was composed by Evan Chamberlain.